On September 1, 1939, German troops thrust deep into Poland, seeking a swift and absolute victory. Barely 20 years earlier, their forefathers had marched back into their homeland as a defeated army in November 1918, after for years of World War I, Germany's Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate. The German armies were being ground down by a relentless offensive from British, French, and U.S. troops, and the German people faced starvation. A dangerous myth was already taking root. German generals and soldiers claimed they had not been defeated in battle but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians. Nevertheless, at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. The following month, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world order. He persuaded the world's leaders to sign up to a League of Nations, agreeing that disputes between countries would now be resolved through debate rather than conflict. At the Treaty of Versailles, the peoples of Europe were set free. Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismembered, and new nations like Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were created. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size. However, this process contained a time bomb. Many new nations, like Czechoslovakia, had significant German minorities. One day, the desire to reunite the German peoples would come to haunt Europe. The war-torn German people faced one final indignity. They were forced to pay £6.6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, which they could hardly afford. When Wilson returned to the United States, his vision of a new world order collapsed. The U.S. Congress refused to join the League of Nations, fearing involvement in another European war, and America retreated into isolationism. Germany had become a democracy under the Weimar Republic, but it was soon struck by a series of blows. Street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists, and in 1923 the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of % per month, wiping out ordinary people's savings. This provided fertile ground for right-wing politicians like Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, Hitler had fought in World War I and been awarded the Iron Cross. Settling in Munich, his fiery speeches helped him seize control of the small National Socialist Nazi Party. In October 1923, he attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government, but it failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. While imprisoned, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, blaming Germany's problems on the Jews and calling for German expansion eastward. Upon his release, Hitler began building the Nazi Party into a disciplined political force, vowing to use the democratic system to achieve power. For the next 5 years, the Weimar Republic prospered and support for extremists waned. Then, in October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, leading to a global economic depression. Unemployment in Germany soared to over 6 million, and extremist politicians once again gained support. By 1931, the Nazis had become a mass movement with nearly 3 million stormtroopers SA as their enforcers. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag, but Hitler refused to join a coalition government, leaving the parliament deadlocked. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made Hitler Chancellor in January 1933. Within a month, the Reichstag building burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers, which he used to ban all other political parties. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler declared himself Führer, or Supreme Leader, of Germany. Over the next 3 years, Hitler rebuilt the German economy and, secretly, its military. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men with no air force or submarines. Hitler soon disregarded these limitations, and by 1935, he revealed Germany's new air force and greatly expanded the army. In 1936, emboldened by his success, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone, and few protested. By the time Germany hosted the 1936 Olympics, many saw the Nazi regime as restoring German pride, unaware of the future threats to peace. Germany's rapid rearmament and territorial ambitions would soon change the world forever. Meanwhile, in Japan, military leaders saw expansion into China as their solution to overpopulation and lack of resources, seizing Manchuria in 1931 and eventually turning their attention to the rest of China. These aggressive moves by Japan, along with Hitler's rise in Germany, set the stage for global conflict. In December 1934, Italy, which already had colonies in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops in the Ogaden region, well within Abyssinian territory. Mussolini sent reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding reparations from Abyssinia. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, appealed to the League of Nations, hoping it would act against this aggression. However, the League did little in response. Britain's foreign minister, Anthony Eden, attempted to broker a peace deal, but Mussolini refused any settlement. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded Abyssinia from Eritrea and Italian Somalia. Abyssinian forces were no match for the modern Italian military, which had artillery and tanks, as well as complete air superiority. The Italian Air Force even used gas bombs, despite their prohibition under the Treaty of Versailles. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun, and Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. The League of Nations imposed economic sanctions, but they had little impact. Mussolini's actions demonstrated to key points the impotence of the League of Nations and the lack of willingness from major European powers, Britain and France, to confront aggression. Both countries were still recovering from the devastation of World War I and were dealing with economic difficulties, including mass unemployment and unrest. Britain's leaders, including Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and Stanley Baldwin, were committed to avoiding future conflicts. Britain, which had downsized its military after World War I, entered the 1930s economically and militarily weak. France, having suffered even greater losses during World War I, maintained a large conscript army but faced a manpower shortage by the 1930s. This led France to adopt a defensive strategy, constructing the Maginot Line along the German border. However, this left France unprepared for offensive actions, such as intervening in Italy's invasion of Abyssinia. By 1936, the threat from Germany and Italy was further demonstrated when both countries supported the rise of General Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. This conflict, which began in July 1936, was brutal and polarized Spain along political, religious, and ideological lines. The left-wing Popular Front government, which had come to power in 1931, was opposed by conservative military officers like Franco, who eventually led a nationalist revolt against the Republic. The Spanish Civil War would become a prelude to the larger conflicts brewing in Europe. General Francisco Franco and his army were in North Africa and needed to cross the Strait of Gibraltar back to Spain. Franco turned to Adolf Hitler for assistance. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's Luftwaffe began an airlift transporting Franco's battle-hardened troops to southern Spain. At this point, the Spanish Republic appeared to have the advantage, with pro-Franco military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona quickly suppressed, leaving the Republic in control of most of the eastern regions. Franco's nationalists were mainly confined to the northwest and parts of the south. However, the nationalists' situation changed drastically when both Hitler and Mussolini provided significant military support. Hitler used the conflict to test Germany's new military equipment, sending panzer tanks, around 12,000 troops, and deploying the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion with modern bombers and fighters. Mussolini also sent a volunteer corps of 50,000 men and over 700 aircraft. The Spanish Republic's appeals to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help were largely in vain. Both Britain and France feared triggering a European war and adopted a policy of non-intervention. Germany and Italy cynically signed this agreement while continuing to support Franco. In response, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin decided to aid the Republic, worried about the growing power of fascism, particularly in Germany, which Hitler had openly declared as communism's ultimate enemy. Stalin saw Spain as a battleground to slow down Germany and Italy while preparing the Soviet Union militarily. He sent 700 military advisors, along with tanks and fighter aircraft, to support the Republic, but this assistance was far less substantial than the aid Franco received. The largest outside support for the Republic came not from a country, but from volunteers. Approximately 30,000 left-wing activists from various countries, including Americans, British, French, and Germans, joined the fight in the international brigades. With German and Italian support, the nationalists were able to open two fronts, one advancing from the north toward Barcelona, and the other led by Franco, pushing northward from the south toward Madrid. By the end of 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides and nearly under siege. The fighting was brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. Republicans targeted Roman Catholic priests, while nationalists executed anyone suspected of being a communist. German and Italian air power bombed civilian targets indiscriminately, with Madrid suffering heavy bombardments. The worst attack came in April 1937 when the town of Guernica was virtually obliterated, killing 6,000 civilians. Despite the Republic's forces fighting valiantly, they were severely undertrained and under-equipped, unable to match Franco's professional soldiers or the modern weaponry of Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the Republican alliance began to fracture. Communists and socialists aimed to win a military victory, while anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as an opportunity for a worker-led revolution. These internal divisions escalated into open conflict in May 1937, with fighting breaking out in Barcelona between anarchists and communists. This infighting severely weakened the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had confined Republican forces to two small enclaves, one around Barcelona and another stretching from Madrid to the coast. Despite fierce resistance, Madrid continued to hold out, but the international brigades were withdrawn and more nations began recognizing Franco's government. By March 1939, the defenders of Madrid, exhausted after nearly 3 years of war, finally surrendered. A month later, Franco emerged victorious. Francisco Franco formally declared the end of hostilities, but the scars of the Spanish Civil War lingered for years, with some never fully healing. Internationally, Franco's victory over the Republic was a disaster. Hitler and Mussolini became more convinced that the democracies of Britain and France were powerless to resist real pressure, while Stalin despaired at their reluctance to confront fascism. Hitler, in particular, saw this as an opportunity to implement the aggressive policies outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were already on the march. From the moment Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, he began putting his long-term ambitions into action. On February 3rd, he informed his top commanders that his ultimate aim was to conquer territory in the East and ruthlessly Germanize it. They were instructed to prepare for a massive expansion. Despite Germany being forbidden from having tanks, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 allowed them to experiment with tank designs and mobile armor tactics. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian studied the theories of British thinkers like Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, even watching British exercises during the 1920s. From these ideas, they developed the concept of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery, and infantry capable of making rapid, deep thrusts into enemy territory. Hitler enthusiastically adopted these ideas, leading to the formation of 3 panzer divisions. Similarly, the new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe under World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring, had a foundation to build on. Despite the Air Force being officially banned, Germany maintained its design skills by focusing on civilian aircraft and using gliding and flying clubs as reserves for potential pilots. Hitler officially revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935, followed by an announcement that the army would increase to 300,000 men and conscription was reintroduced. Although Britain and France protested against this blatant breach of the Treaty of Versailles, their response was weak and they reluctantly and slowly began to rearm. Until this point, Hitler had been modest in his territorial ambitions, reclaiming only what had belonged to Germany, the Rhineland, and the Saar. However, he now had a grander target in mind, his homeland, Austria. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had tried to seize power and unify the country with Germany, as Austrians spoke German, even if they had never been part of a unified German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was uncovered, prompting Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg to protest to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop mistreating Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany. Schuschnigg attempted to prevent annexation by calling for a referendum, allowing Austrians to vote on whether to remain independent. However, on March 12, 1938, the eve of the referendum, Hitler, fearing an unfavorable result, sent in his troops. The invasion took Austria by complete surprise and was met with an enthusiastic welcome by Nazi sympathizers. Within hours, Hitler declared Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich, marking the first time a sovereign nation was absorbed into Greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to react. In the summer of 1938, Hitler set his sights on his next target, Czechoslovakia. The northwest region of the country, known as the Sudetenland, had a substantial German-speaking population. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the old Austrian Empire but were separated when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919, following the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler encouraged Sudeten German demands for autonomy, then threatened the Czech government with force if they refused. Undeterred, the Czechoslovak government ordered a general mobilization and prepared to resist. The Czechoslovak army was large, well-equipped, and protected by formidable fortifications along its border with Germany. Hitler initially backed off from his aggressive stance toward Czechoslovakia, but by September 1938, with tensions rising and the threat of war becoming imminent, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene as a peacemaker. Hitler demanded the return of the port of Danzig-Dosk to German control to connect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. The Polish government refused, and Hitler hesitated, as he was not quite ready for an all-out war and still had unfinished business in Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Slovakia, the ethnically distinct eastern part of Czechoslovakia, appealed to Hitler for help in gaining greater independence. Hitler summoned the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hácha to Berlin and coerced him into placing Czechoslovakia under German protection. German troops marched into the rest of the country, annexing most of it into the Reich, while Slovakia became a nominally independent protectorate. This marked the first time Hitler had seized non-German-speaking territory, yet Britain and France responded only with weak protests. At the end of March 1939, Hitler once again demanded that Poland give up Danzig. This time, Britain and France declared that they would go to war if he attacked Poland. However, Hitler, confident in the weakness and indecision of the Western powers, paid little heed to their warnings. Meanwhile, in Russia, Stalin, alarmed by Hitler's aggressive expansionism, proposed an alliance with Britain and France in April. However, the negotiations stalled, and Stalin ultimately sought another solution to the German threat. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany shocked the world by announcing a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The secret part of the agreement divided Poland between the two powers and gave Stalin a free hand to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. With the threat of Russian intervention neutralized, Hitler ordered preparations for an immediate invasion of Poland. On the evening of August 31, 1939, German forces finalized their preparations. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, German soldiers, dressed in Polish uniforms, staged a fake attack on a German radio station, providing Hitler with a pretext for invasion. At 8 a.m. that same morning, German troops crossed the Polish border, launching the invasion. These tanks were designed to break through enemy defenses and strike deep into enemy territory, severing communications and creating chaos. The German Luftwaffe, with 2,500 aircraft, including the notorious Ru-87 Stuka dive bomber, played a key role in supporting the ground forces. Geography also worked against Poland. After the German annexation of Czechoslovakia, Warsaw, the Polish capital, was surrounded on three sides by German-controlled territory. German tanks spearheaded the invasion, creating breakthroughs, while fast-moving infantry and air support followed to crush Polish resistance. Within days, the Polish Air Force was eliminated, and Polish troops were trapped in pockets, surrounded, and forced to surrender. By September 8th, German forces were approaching Warsaw, and on September 17th, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east, in line with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Polish army was now in full retreat, with the government fleeing abroad. Despite Warsaw's stubborn resistance, the city surrendered on September 27th. The next day, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Both occupying powers quickly began rounding up and murdering anyone they deemed a threat. In Eastern Europe, Nazi forces began to reveal their brutality, especially toward those they considered racially inferior, such as Jews, who were forced into ghettos or executed. Despite the catastrophic defeat, over 50,000 Polish troops escaped to France, where a provisional government was established under General Władysław Sikorski. The Polish forces would continue fighting from abroad. Meanwhile, in Britain, air raid sirens blared within minutes of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's announcement that hostilities had begun. Despite their promises to defend Poland, both Britain and France did very little to help in the face of Hitler's calculated gamble. This passage narrates the tense and unpredictable early months of World War II. From the mobilization of British and French forces to Germany's rapid and strategic military campaigns. After declaring war, Britain and France ramped up preparations, with children evacuated, gas masks distributed, and blackouts enforced, but they were hesitant to take decisive military action. Meanwhile, Hitler's early blitzkrieg against Poland was a resounding success, and though he planned to strike at France and Britain quickly, logistical setbacks delayed the attack. The British and French adopted defensive positions, with the French relying heavily on the Maginot Line, a vast fortification intended to protect the country. However, Britain underestimated Germany's naval threat, suffering losses to U-boats in the Atlantic. On the other side, Germany's navy, though small, caused significant damage, especially with commerce-raiding ships like the Graf Spee, which was eventually cornered and scuttled by the British. In the east, another front opened when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in late 1939. Facing unexpected resistance from the outnumbered but determined Finns, the Winter War demonstrated the weaknesses in Stalin's purged Red Army but eventually led to Finland's ceding territory. Hitler then turned his attention to securing Scandinavia, vital for Nazi war production. When the Germans attacked the Allies, they planned for their forces west of the Maginot Line to swing forward into Belgium. This would allow them to hold the Allies on a shorter and more defensible line along the rivers Dyle and Meuse. However, on January 10, 1940, a German liaison aircraft lost its way and crashed in Belgium, where a copy of the German plan was found. He was concerned that the German forces would become bogged down as they had in World War I, leading to a long and drawn-out war. Therefore, he proposed to Hitler that the main thrust should be directed at the point where the Maginot Line ended, targeting the area where the Allies were most vulnerable. As the Western armies advanced, most of Germany's panzer divisions would be concentrated opposite the Ardennes in southeast Belgium, an area the Allies considered almost impossible for tanks and therefore lightly defended. The German plan was to drive deep behind the Allied armies, which would be advancing into Belgium. By doing this, they could cut off the Allied forces while bypassing those sitting in the Maginot Line. It was a high-risk strategy, as the German armor could become stuck in the forest, but Hitler loved the idea, so the German forces were redeployed without the Allies' knowledge. Meanwhile, the Allies prepared for a long defensive war. In addition to the formidable barrier of the Maginot Line, they had a slight advantage in manpower. With about 110 divisions available against 95 German divisions, and in armor with around 3,000 vehicles compared to 2,700 German tanks. The French also possessed better tanks. Their 32-ton Charbie had both 75mm and 47mm guns. However, the main gun was mounted in the hull, making it difficult to aim. In contrast, the newest German design, the 17-ton Panzer Mark V, featured a 75mm gun in a spacious three-man turret, allowing its crew to work effectively as a team, although only about 100 of these tanks were available. The other main French tanks also had guns matching their German counterparts, but again, the French design suffered from having a one-man turret. The area where the Germans had a clear advantage was in the air. The Luftwaffe had 2,000 bombers, while the Allies only had 800. The Luftwaffe also had 4,000 fighters, including the ultramodern Messerschmitt Bf 109, while the Allies faced 2,500 mainly older aircraft. Their armor was grouped into 10 independent panzer divisions. In contrast, the French were preparing for a repeat of the static fighting of World War I, viewing tanks as infantry support and distributing them piecemeal instead of concentrating them. They had noticed the success of Germany's panzer divisions in Poland and were assembling 3 armored divisions, but by the start of hostilities, none were fully operational. 2 different military strategies were about to clash, blitzkrieg against static warfare. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain, which coincided with the day Hitler chose to launch his blitzkrieg against France and Britain. At dawn, a whole German airborne division parachuted into Holland to seize bridges and airfields. However, none of the Allied commanders seemed to have noticed that German Army Gruppe, which had the bulk of the panzers, was now driving through the hills and woods of the Ardennes to their south. The Germans pushed rapidly through Holland. The obsolete Dutch army was no match for the highly efficient German war machine and was under continual heavy air attack by the Luftwaffe, which roamed the skies unchallenged. On May 14th, the Germans demanded the surrender of the port of Rotterdam. While they were airborne, the Dutch hesitated, and when they eventually agreed to surrender the city, a recall message never reached the bombers, leading to the devastation of Rotterdam. The Dutch capitulated the next day. Then came the hammer blow. Something British and French planners had thought impossible had happened. German panzers had broken through the Ardennes and reached the Meuse by the evening of May 12th. Among the first to arrive at Sedan, north of the Maginot Line, were the men of the 19th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, fresh from his triumphs in Poland. Guderian demonstrated how blitzkrieg should be executed. He ignored the troops in the Maginot Line and did not wait for his own infantry to catch up, pushing straight on. The next day, assault troops crossed the Meuse River, and engineers began building bridges for the armor under heavy French fire. By the evening, Guderian's bridgehead was 8 miles deep. The French troops stuck in the Maginot Line were too immobile to intervene, and Allied bombers made desperate attempts to destroy the German bridges, but most were shot down. Meanwhile, German artillery pounded the French defenses. In just 3 days after the attack had begun, the French defenders around Sedan broke. Guderian's panzers began racing westwards, having advanced more than 40 miles behind the northern group of Allied armies, which had been holding firm along the Dial line. Suddenly, French Supreme Commander General Maxime Weygand realized that they were about to be encircled and ordered a withdrawal. This sudden decision bewildered the Allied troops, who had no idea what was happening behind them. As they fell back, they were hindered by a growing flood of refugees clogging the roads. On that day, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud phoned Churchill, stating, "We are beaten. We have lost the battle, but for all the brilliance of blitzkrieg, the Germans were now vulnerable." As the panzers raced westwards, they created an ever longer corridor just a few miles wide, which was open to counterattack. The bulk of the German army was still reliant on horsepower or its own feet for transport, causing the gap between the rampaging panzers and the follow-up infantry to grow with every hour. On May 17th, Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding one of the newly formed French armored divisions, made the first of 2 attempts to cut through the German line near Cessy. However, the cumbersome French command system meant that units were sent into battle piecemeal rather than in a coordinated thrust. The Germans had little difficulty warding off both attacks and inflicted heavy casualties. It seemed nothing could now stop Guderian. He plunged further into France. By the 19th, his lead units passed Peronne, and on the 20th, in an extraordinary 56-mile dash, Amiens was taken by lunchtime. Abbeville, just 14 miles from the English Channel, was seized by 9 that evening. By midnight, a battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the coast at Noyon. The Germans had split the Allied front in two. Everything now depended on whether they could defend this long, thin corridor or whether the Allies could successfully counterattack. The British prepared to break the German lines. On May 21st, two armored battalions were set to launch an attack south of Arras. However, the British tanks were even less suited to fast-moving armored warfare than the French. Their most effective machine, the WW2, had been designed for infantry support. Although well-armored, it was slow and undergunned, and the Germans had little trouble repelling the attack. Nevertheless, this action did have an effect. By now, the German high command was becoming worried about their extended lines of communication. Consequently, for the time being, further advances into the rest of France were put on hold until the infantry could catch up. The priority shifted to turning north to eliminate the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army fighting alongside it. On May 22nd, Guderian and the Panzers began their assault to destroy the Allied armies, who were now pulling back to the ports of Boulogne and Dunkirk. The port of Boulogne had been overrun, and German troops had isolated Calais. The British were being forced back to the port of Dunkirk. Lord Gort, the British commander, advised his government that the only hope of saving even a fraction of his troops was to organize an evacuation by sea. However, as dive bombers screamed down and the panzers were poised for the final assault, evacuation seemed a forlorn hope. As German forces surged towards Dunkirk, the Luftwaffe attacked, and the Allies desperately prepared for a counteroffensive. General Gerd von Rundstedt, now in command of Army Gruppe, ordered the panzers to capture the port at all costs. But the attack was postponed for 24 hours, allowing the British a critical respite. On May 26th, the German assault finally began. The Luftwaffe bombed Dunkirk relentlessly while the ground troops closed in. However, British Royal Navy vessels and civilian boats braved the stormy waters of the English Channel, ferrying thousands of men to safety. By the time the evacuation was called off on June 4th, over 300,000 British and French soldiers had been rescued, a testament to the sheer determination and resolve of the Allied forces. Dunkirk was a turning point in the war. Despite the chaos and disorder, the Allies had successfully extricated themselves from the jaws of defeat, buying themselves precious time to regroup and rebuild. In the port of Mers el-Kabir in French North Africa lay a powerful squadron of 2 French battleships and 2 battle cruisers. If these ships fell into German hands, the British Navy's position in the Mediterranean would become untenable. On July 3rd, a Royal Navy task force demanded that the French ships either join them or sail to a neutral port for internment. The French refused, leading to a shocking decision by the British. They opened fire on their former allies. 3 battleships were either destroyed or severely damaged, resulting in the tragic loss of nearly 1,300 French sailors. Meanwhile, Hitler celebrated his triumph upon returning to Berlin on July 19th, greeted by over 1 million people. In his speech to the Reichstag, he offered peace terms to Britain, proposing that they keep their empire in exchange for a free hand in Europe. His plan involved conquering eastern countries to secure Lebensraum for the German people. However, Churchill resolutely rejected the offer, declaring that Britain would continue to fight. This defiance resonated with the public. King George VI noted in his diary that he felt relieved not to have allies to appease. Despite surviving Dunkirk, the British Army was in dire straits, having lost nearly all its tanks, artillery, and transport. Armed primarily with rifles, they had only 25 divisions to resist the German war machine. With little choice but to dig in and prepare for a potential invasion, coastal defenses were fortified, concrete strong points erected across southern England, and signposts were removed to confuse any invaders. A volunteer defense force, the Home Guard, was established, consisting of men ineligible for active service, often due to age. By the end of June 1940, nearly 1.5 million volunteers had signed up, but they were largely unarmed. Hitler, meanwhile, advanced his invasion plans, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Some 20 divisions were set to land along the southern coast, and barges were hastily converted into landing craft. Despite his bravado, the German naval chief, Admiral Erich Raeder, lacked confidence in seizing control of the English Channel long enough for a successful invasion. While Germany had a significant numerical advantage in the air with the Luftwaffe, the Royal Navy remained the largest fleet in the world, even if stretched thin by global commitments. Acknowledging the overwhelming odds, Dowding chose to conserve his fighters, only engaging in major assaults when necessary. A crucial British innovation during this period was radar. Scientists led by Robert Watson Watt developed a system to detect incoming aircraft by bouncing radio pulses off them. This technology became the backbone of Britain's air defense, known as Chain Home, a network of radar masts along the south and east coasts. By providing early warnings, radar allowed the Royal Air Force (RAF) to prepare for impending attacks. As the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe sought to lure the RAF into combat, but Dowding remained strategic, conserving his forces for the main battle yet to come.
As the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe sought to lure the RAF into combat, but Dowding remained strategic, conserving his forces for the main battle yet to come. German forces had a significant numerical advantage, with 1,100 single-engine fighters against the RAF's 700.
The battle intensified on August 15th, when waves of German bombers faced fierce began nighttime raids, known as the Blitz, on British cities. Churchill recognized the need for external support. He turned his attention to the United States, where the public remained largely isolationist despite the growing threat. However, by 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preparing the American public for potential involvement. He expanded the U.S. Navy and sought to strengthen ties with Britain. Churchill's efforts culminated in a historic agreement in which the U.S. would supply Britain with destroyers in exchange for military bases, marking a significant shift in American policy. As public sentiment began to change, influenced by the courage displayed during the Blitz and the relentless determination of the British people, Churchill's vision for a united front against tyranny gained traction. On the evening of December 29, 1940, London faced its first wave of bombers around 6:30. Fires erupted from the top stories of buildings, and Hitler's boast to rub out their cities seemed closer to reality. In response to this aggression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Lend-Lease Bill, allowing the U.S. to supply weapons and war materials to Britain and China, which was struggling against Japanese invasion. Roosevelt likened Lend-Lease to lending a neighbor a hose to extinguish a fire, with the expectation of worrying about repayment later. Roosevelt's actions reflected strategic foresight. Unlike the situation in 1917, the U.S. would already have a robust weapons industry if it needed to enter the war. By April 1941, he felt secure enough to extend the Pan-American Security Zone, which allowed U.S. warships to protect American merchant vessels. U.S. troops established bases in Greenland and replaced British garrisons in Iceland to prevent German control over those areas. The U.S. Navy also provided limited convoy escorts for ships carrying Lend-Lease materials. Despite Hitler's instructions to avoid provoking the U.S. into war, tensions escalated. On September 4, 1941, a British aircraft mistakenly attacked a German submarine, leading to a 3-hour battle with the U.S. destroyer Greer. Later, on November 17th, the destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed during convoy duty, resulting in 11 American sailors' deaths. Although Roosevelt protested, the American public largely opposed entering the war. Meanwhile, Britain relied heavily on a secret weapon located at Bletchley Park, where cryptographers successfully decoded Germany's Enigma machine messages. The Enigma machine, developed in the early 1920s, encoded messages using 3 rotors, allowing for a staggering 150 million possible settings, making it seem uncrackable to the Germans. Polish mathematicians first made strides in decoding Enigma messages, aided by intelligence from French sources. As the threat of war increased, British and French intelligence officers were astonished by the Polish team's progress and sent to reconstructed Enigma machines to London. When Poland fell, Polish cryptographers destroyed evidence of their work to protect it from German capture. The British Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, led by Commander Alastair Denniston, took over the task of decoding. Among the recruited experts was Alan Turing, who designed decryption machines known as bomb machines. Bletchley Park received signals from British radio monitoring stations, which recorded German communications. As messages were decrypted, they were analyzed and shared with relevant military authorities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognized the significance of Bletchley Park's work and referred to its intelligence as ultra, with its distribution tightly controlled to maintain secrecy. During the Battle of Britain, Bletchley Park provided crucial insights into German tactics, enabling British commanders to strategize effectively. As Britain continued to fight alone in 1941, Churchill sought immediate action against the Germans. He called for the formation of raiding forces to strike at occupied Europe. This led to the establishment of 10 commando units trained for attacks from the sea. On March 4, 1941, the commando units launched a successful raid on the Lofoten Islands in Norway, destroying factories that converted fish oil into glycerin for explosives. Their surprise attack yielded significant results, including capturing German soldiers and Norwegian collaborators, as well as boosting British morale. More importantly, they seized a set of Enigma rotors that would aid Bletchley Park in breaking German naval codes. In December 1941, further commando operations in Norway engaged in heavy fighting, showcasing the growing importance of covert operations alongside intelligence efforts at Bletchley Park. The approach to Vero was initially obstructed by the small island of Marlow, where German artillery was stationed. However, this stronghold was quickly overrun, leading to intense fighting in Vero itself, which lasted several hours until the main German garrison was subdued. Before retreating, the German commanders blew up several factories and sank 8 ships, actions that convinced Hitler to maintain a military presence in Norway for the remainder of the war, keeping 250,000 troops there despite the need for reinforcements on other fronts. To combat the Nazis, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sought alternative strategies, focusing on fostering resistance movements in occupied countries. In July 1940, he established the Special Operations Executive SOE, which aimed to encourage sabotage of the enemy's war efforts, gather intelligence, and prepare clandestine forces to disrupt German defenses. Much of SOE's work centered on France, where agents were recruited and trained to build and coordinate resistance networks. However, penetrating German coastal defenses proved challenging, leading to a shift in strategy. Aircraft became the primary means for delivering agents and equipment, which were parachuted in or flown in on moonlit nights. Meanwhile, the German counter-espionage efforts intensified, utilizing advanced technology to locate hidden radios and infiltrate resistance networks, making the work of SOE agents perilous. Despite the danger, Churchill believed that sustaining resistance was crucial for maintaining hope among occupied populations. The British Broadcasting Corporation (BBC) also played a significant role by broadcasting news in the languages of occupied nations, risking severe penalties for listeners but providing coded messages to resistance groups. As 1941 progressed, the situation for Britain changed dramatically when the Soviet Union, once an ally of Germany, became embroiled in conflict with Hitler's forces. With Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, Hitler aimed to conquer the Soviet Union, redeploying vast numbers of troops and resources. Despite Stalin's efforts to maintain peace and avoid provoking Hitler, the Red Army was unprepared for the onslaught. Following the rapid German invasion of the Balkans, Hitler turned his full attention to the east, with Operation Barbarossa mobilizing over 4 million troops against the Soviet Union. Initial German advances were successful, with panzers rapidly penetrating Soviet territory and the Luftwaffe achieving air superiority. However, as the Germans surrounded and captured large numbers of Soviet troops, the tide began to shift and morale within the Red Army improved, leading to counterattacks that would challenge German progress. By July, the situation became precarious for the Germans, as Hitler's decision to delay the advance on Moscow in favor of securing other objectives would ultimately prove to be a strategic blunder. As the summer wore on, the mobilization of Soviet forces and their growing effectiveness in counterattacks signaled a more challenging campaign than Hitler had anticipated. The Red Army now had formidable new weapons, particularly the T-30 for tank, equipped with a 76mm gun. It was faster and better cross-country than the Panzer Mark IV. Yet, as the Blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to miss the warning signs. The German Panzer Group began its thrust south on August 23, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South struck north 3 weeks later, meeting the pincers east of Kiev on September 16. 2 more Soviet armies were utterly destroyed, with 500,000 men killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. It was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union, and the city was besieged. Hitler decided not to storm it. Instead, the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Hitler decided not to storm it. Instead, the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Conditions in the city became dire. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could come in by water. Starvation set in, and over 11,000 people died in November. Not until December could an ice road be opened across the lake, resulting in a slight increase in rations, but 3,700 people died of starvation on one day in December alone. Meanwhile, Army Group Center prepared for the final assault on Moscow. The German panzers had rejoined it to lead the blitzkrieg. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the front and a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft. The assault started on September 20, 1941, and once again, the German panzers slashed deep through the Red Army. By October 7th, yet more Soviet troops were surrounded. However, Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last and appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense of the city. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. The real obstacle to the German advance would be the weather. On October 8th, heavy rain set in, causing German vehicles to become bogged down in a sea of mud. By late October, appalling weather and increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant Army Group Center was still about 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his earlier decision to delay his advance on Moscow. Around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers, with another 100,000 prisoners taken. However, they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kaluga was captured on October 24, 1941. But the weather was now starting to freeze, and the German forces, confident the campaign would be over by summer, were caught unprepared without winter clothing. They now suffered terribly on the Moscow front. Army Group Center began its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square, and some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. However, that night, the temperature plunged again, causing tank engines to fail and weapons to freeze. Many soldiers suffered severe frostbite. On December 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army. The Germans were confident that come spring, they could finish the job. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the German onslaught, but he had another worrying, that the Japanese would attack his forces in Siberia. In November, the Soviet dictator received a message from his top spy in Japan assuring him that the Japanese had no such intention. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. These troops were well-equipped and well-trained in winter fighting. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in position near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their attempt to capture Moscow, they were hit by a savage Russian attack. It began with a massive Soviet artillery barrage, followed by swarms of Soviet T-34s crashing through the German defenses. Stunned by the savagery of the attack from an enemy they had assumed was on the ropes, the Germans fell back. For the next 7 days, the Soviet troops tore into the German forces. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, this was a terrible blow. On December 19th, he sacked his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed command himself. In addition, Hindenburg was also sacked along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now ordered that there would be no more retreats and the German troops should fight, and if necessary die, where they stood. This tactic worked and the German line gradually steadied. However, Stalin, elated by the Red Army's success, now demanded a massive advance across the whole front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to and expected quick results, but he was now dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union, facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Nor was Russia his only headache. On December 7, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to and expected quick results. But he was now dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union, facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Nor was Russia his only headache. On December 7, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. Almost thoughtlessly, Hitler declared war on the US, taking on a massive new enemy. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to go on the offensive again in Russia, but he needed a new strategy. The original plan of fighting across the whole front was no longer tenable. Moreover, as his economic advisors warned him, Germany's all supplies were running low. Therefore, he decided to halt the attacks in the north and instead head for Russia's all fields in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue envisioned an assault south of Kaluga, with Army Group A swinging down to seize the all fields while Army Group B covered its flank along the Don River. Straight away, there was a brutal encounter with Soviet forces trying to retake Kaluga. Another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured and 70,000 were killed. As part of the same operation, the Germans tightened their siege of the port of Sebastopol in the Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders had been under constant bombardment from German artillery, including a massive 400mm railway gun. In late June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans. It was now safe for them to head for the all fields. On June 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way through to the Don River and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A faced stronger resistance, but by July 9th, it was close to Rostov. Frustrated by the slow progress of the campaign in the Caucasus, Hitler made a series of strategic blunders, ordering Army Group B to capture Stalingrad, even though the city had no immediate strategic significance. 2 weeks later, frustrated by the slow progress, he diverted the bulk of his panzers down to the mountains. The march on Stalingrad slowed noticeably as the reinforced Army Group A raced across the Caucasus, getting within 70 miles of the Caspian Sea and threatening to cut off all the Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress in Stalingrad, he ordered the panzers back up north. On August 9th, Army Group A seized the first of the southern oil fields at Makeup, only to find them comprehensively trashed. Without reinforcements, they could go no further, and the huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained beyond their grasp. By now, Hitler's attention had shifted again. In late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The battle for the city, which bore the name of Hitler's archenemy, had begun. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don and began a final push on Stalingrad. 6 days later, one panzer thrust had reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were fighting in the outer suburbs.